This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. A report released by China's State Council says that the human rights situation in the United States worsened in 2021. The report points to rising racism, violent crime, ill treatment of immigrants, and abuse of military force and economic sanctions. Who should be held accountable for these abuses? And in the face of such violations, how can the U.S. continue to hail itself as a human rights defender? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Victor Gao Zhikai, Chair Professor of Suzhou University, Mark Sloboda, a Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst, and Brandon Andrews, who is a former HIO staffer and an entrepreneur. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Victor, I will start with you. The Chinese report details how the U.S. violated human rights in 2021. So what are some of the highlights for you?
Well, it is very obvious that there are very widespread human rights violations and abuses in the United States in terms of racism of all kinds against different ethnic minorities, especially against Afro-Americans. And then during the pandemic, for example, wanton disregard of how to protect lives of the people, especially people in the lower income category. And then you are talking about extreme bipolarization of wealth. The top 1% of the people in the United States enjoy a very large, disproportionately large proportion of the total wealth in the United States. And then you have gun violence of all kinds and innocent people being lost at the hands of those who abuse gun ownership in the United States. The list is very long. From the outside's perspective, we would see there are very extreme forms of human rights abuses and violations in the United States. And I hope the U.S. government leaders will acknowledge the fact that the United States does not have a perfect record in terms of protection of human rights and try to avoid pretending to be a priest in lecturing the rest of the world in terms of human rights protection.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mark, as Victor pointed out, the U.S. usually, basically pick itself as a judge about human rights record, of nations around the world. But its own record, obviously, is far from being perfect.
Yes, I mean, it's quite obvious that the U.S. Specifically uses the issue of human rights as a weapon, as a geopolitical weapon against its adversaries, while passing itself and its allies. And you don't have to trust me on that. You can trust the U.S. State Department. In 2017, the then assistant to the new Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, he sent a memo to Rex Tillerson, who was new in the position, instructing him on how to deal with the human rights issue. And this memo was leaked and reported on by Politico. It's on the internet for anyone to see. And it specifically highlighted that the U.S. should use human rights as a club to beat its adversaries, Iran, China, and North Korea, while giving a pass to repressive but friendly allies like the Philippines, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. And to quote, allies should be treated differently and better than adversaries. Otherwise, we will end up with more adversaries and fewer allies. And, that sums up. I think basically what it says is that everything that the U.S. says in its critique of other countries with its human rights should be taken with a degree of salt and realize that it is being used as a weapon in the pursuit of U.S. hegemony against countries that do not align themselves with U.S. foreign policy interests.
Right. Brandon, let's put aside the politicization of the concept of human rights. If you take a close look at the U.S. record, for example, about the handling of COVID-19, we see the fatalities is rapidly approaching the 1 million deaths in the country, and also in terms of infections, the U.S. also had the largest number. This is against the fact, and the U.S. with having the world's most advanced medical equipment and also high technology over there. People pointed to Trump and people point to others, but it seems to me that's all they do, and nobody is being punished or nobody is being basically singled out for doing anything wrong about that.
Well, in terms of COVID-19 response, the U.S. could have done more earlier to prepare the population and also to put resources in place, the necessary resources in place to combat the disease. Now, some of what you see in terms of the larger amounts of cases in the United States was because there was admittedly slower action at the beginning. However, the action from government certainly ramped up, but a lot of what you see is because Americans do have the freedom to choose. And a lot of Americans chose not to take the vaccine when it was available. A lot of Americans chose not to do some of the vaccine mitigation things like wearing a mask, and some of those things directly a cause of Americans having more freedom of choice led to more cases and certainly a higher percentage than we see in a lot of other places. Could more have been done at the beginning? Yes, but there's also a choice factor here that I think is important to consider.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting point, Victor. Some people would say, for Chinese people, basically there's no dispute that there's a dereliction or problem with the government in terms of their ability or competency to handle the crisis. If you look at China's zero COVID situation, basically Chinese people enjoy a relatively normal environment during the past more than 2 years, almost 3 years. And for Chinese people, that's a human rights violation. That's about the right to life, right to health. It seems to me like it's a different concept, a different understanding of what is human rights. For the U.S., people would say that's about my choice, that's about my freedom, instead of the right to life and health.
Well, regarding to this very important question, I think first of all, philosophically speaking, when you are dealing with a virus, a pandemic, always put science above everything else. Politics should give way to science. Therefore, I think China puts science first. China listens very carefully to the doctors, the scientists in this particular regard, and came up with a very unique way of dealing with this virus. Now, of course, people in all countries value things like human rights or freedom and your own personal choices. But when you are faced with the choice of getting infected or die because of infection versus keeping yourself healthy and keeping your family healthy, and also prevent to spread the virus to others in your society, there is a higher level of analysis. Your so-called personal freedom should not trump your obligation to protect yourself and protect your family and society at large. And in this regard, the government has a role to play. We believe the government has to play a positive role to educate the population at large, to help the population, to prevent the population from getting infected and die. And we believe this is, as you mentioned correctly, very much part of human rights as we understand here in China. Whereas in the United States, I think government dereliction of duty, and they putting politics above science, and then they confuse the right way to deal with the pandemic versus the other so-called ways, including what President Trump, when he was still the president, preached to the population at large. This was not science. This was not protecting the rights of the American people. This was dereliction against the fundamental interest of the American people. In a sense, it is a violation of the real human rights of the American people.
Well, obviously, people can stress, human rights in terms of freedom, in terms of rights. but also there's another key word that is responsibility and obligation, right? Let's move on to take a look at the racism, as pointed out in the report. The report says there's a rising racism against Asian Americans. There's a research which finds that hate crimes targeting the Asian American community have increased by 339% last year compared to the year before. Brandon, why are the Asian Americans, facing increasingly severe discrimination and violent attacks?
Yeah, I think xenophobia, especially around this COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of hate speech directed at Asian Americans, and we have to stop Asian hate. I align myself with that Stop Asian Hate movement. But what we saw is Americans being sometimes confused, and other Americans who have long held racial bias and racial animus taking the opportunity during COVID-19 to attack communities that they already didn't like, or communities that they felt were a cause of the global pandemic that we entered into. The bottom line is it wasn't right. It shouldn't have happened, and it shouldn't continue to happen. What we have seen is a large social movement in solidarity with our Asian American brothers and sisters, and I think that's what we have to continue to see. We have to see that groundswell from everyday people to push back on some of this hate speech.
Well, good to hear that. Mark, obviously, some people would say it has a lot to do with that the reality, that is basically the anti-China sentiment that's rife probably in the media and also among the U.S. senior officials. For example, I think his FBI director basically has said that every Chinese face could be a spy, and also there's a China initiative targeting the Chinese intellectuals, mostly professors in universities over there. So that kind of creating this fear about Chinese, about Asians over there. Is that the situation?
Yes, you hit it dead on. There is a direct and clear correlation between increasing U.S. government presentation of China as an adversary that needs to be confronted, and the rise in anti-China sentiment in the United States, which, previously, 10 years ago, it was negligible. But with the sharp rise in rhetoric and this military posture began under President Obama, the Asian pivot to confront and contain China, you have seen the number of hate crimes against Asian Americans skyrocket in the United States. And it is a direct result of this demonization of China. And let's face it, Americans are simply incapable of differentiating the ethnicities, the countries of origin of different Asian Americans. And they all get lumped together in the same anti-China hate category.
In a sense, Victor, it's very unfortunate because there's a rising competition, mostly from Washington against Beijing. There's a worry that whether China will continue to develop and replace the U.S. as the #1 country. So there are folks they more or less involved or engaged in this anti-China demonization of China that result in this kind of anti-China sentiment among the public, basically.
Absolutely. I think it is not only unfortunate, this is also legally wrong and morally indecent for some Americans to commit such racial discrimination against Asian Americans in general and Chinese Americans in particular. Now, Asian Americans and Chinese Americans in particular have been really exemplary citizens in the United States. They abide by the local laws, they work very hard, they contribute to the society at large, and they are law-abiding to a very large extent. Therefore, to single out Chinese Americans or Asian Americans, sometimes Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, or Vietnamese Americans, you name it, it is very, very hurtful to the feeling not only of these American Americans of Asian origins, but also the Chinese people and the Asian people at large. Fundamentally, it will not be good for the American interest because you need to really promote racial harmony, social coherence in the United States, which will really help the United States to emancipate more power, more productivity and efficiency in the society. If you really disregard the contributions by one particular ethnic group versus the others and discriminate against them, it is unfair, it is indecent, and this is very poisonous of the racial harmony in the United States at large.
It hurts the country itself. Well, Brandon, obviously, racism, usually we mention that we think of African Americans, for example, George Floyd, this almost 2 years to his death over there. What about any progress or any reforms in that front to reduce police brutality?
Yeah, and this, as you know, is a long-standing issue in the United States of America. There's the original sin of slavery and then years of discrimination against Black Americans. Actually, you talk about holding the United States accountable on the world stage. W.B. Du Bois actually took a petition to the United Nations when the United Nations was first started and detailed the history of racial animus and racial violence against Black Americans with the United Nations, and petitioned that that the world should hold the United States accountable. We've seen progress here, but not enough progress. Something that has been encouraging is the trials of the men who murdered George Floyd and the men who murdered Ahmaud Arbery, another unarmed Black man who was killed in the United States. They have returned convictions, and there's accountability there at a local level. Is that enough? No. Does more need to be done? Yes. Are we where we should be? Absolutely not. However, there's certainly progress being made, and that's more encouraging than things have been in the past.
Well, recently there's an interesting incident, like an episode by CBS News, I believe. There's a reporter, who is white. Basically, he was doing a live coverage of the situation in Ukraine about the war over there. He said that this is shocking. He has the sympathy because it is not Iraq or Afghanistan. In Ukraine, basically, this is relatively European, relatively civilized. Do you see the racism running through under the skin in many Americans over there? I'm not sure. Many Americans, at least a lot of people there, basically, because of political correctness, you don't say it, but sometimes it creeped out of you.
Yeah, there's no excuse for those racist dog whistles that came from that reporter. Yes, our bias does come out. Sometimes in the most unlikely and for that reporter, hopefully embarrassing of moments, and hopefully that reporter will be held accountable. I think we also have to talk about, since you mentioned Ukraine, Black people from the African diaspora are being discriminated against as they try to flee Ukraine as refugees. Yes. Many of them are being turned back at the border by European nations, and that has to be addressed as well. I know there are some international organizations who are writing an open letter about that this week, and it needs to be addressed as that crisis continues. But back to the United States, yes, bias does exist. The question is, are we addressing it? Yes. And I think this international report that's come in will help with addressing it. I think the biggest thing that we have to think about here is, as we list out these issues, these human rights issues in the United States of America, can we say, as we look at the list, things are being done to make a positive impact or make some kind of change on these issues? On a number of them there are. On a number, there's still a lot more work to be done. Is the country full of people that have bias against other cultures? Yes. But is that getting better? I definitely do think so.
Obviously, Victor, this is beyond America in the sense, in terms of the racism against, let's say, African people. For example, as Brandon mentioned, when they were trying to flee from Ukraine, they were basically refused or rejected. And the same happened to, I think, Afghan refugees. They lived in Ukraine while they are trying to leave. They also probably rejected, according to some of the reports. So it's not only America, but also European countries too here.
Absolutely. I think if you look at Europe or North America in particular, there are different shades and shapes of racism of different kinds against different ethnic groups. Now, if we talk about the Afro-Americans, of course, they have suffered so much. They were enslaved for hundreds of years, and then for another 100 years or so after their emancipation, their political rights were not restored to them. And now, because of centuries of backwardness, oppression, and exploitation, they suffer as lower classes of the people without due access to social benefits, education, medical care, etc. It's unfair. This needs to be addressed fundamentally. I would say until and unless the United States fully restore the full rights of the Afro-Americans as equal citizens of the American citizens at large, the United States has no justification to lecture other nations in the world about how to abide by human rights. Human rights should start at home. Deal with Afro-Americans decently, deal with Asian Americans decently, restore and acknowledge the sin they committed in genocide against the Native American Indians, for example. Until and unless the United States authorities do this, they do not have any legal standing to preach to other nations about human rights.
Well, Brandon, you mentioned about, it's really about whether there are progress, whether the government is taking the necessary measures. One thing probably the government is far from doing enough. Let's say the gun violence, violent crimes in the United States, that's soared during this pandemic period. There were 693 mass shootings in the U.S. last year. That's up more than 10% from 2020, according to the report. More than 44,000 people were killed by gun violence last year. Senseless killing and unnecessary death. How can the government in any way justify such practice? We don't see progress in that regard at all.
Well, as you know, Americans have a unique relationship, not just with guns, but with the concept of being able to defend themselves personally if they feel their civil liberties in particular, but even human rights more broadly, are being violated by government or by authority. And so because of that, there is a lot more gun ownership in the United States. And when you have more of something like gun ownership, the likelihood of those guns being used and being turned on people increases significantly. And so this has been a consistent thing throughout the history of the United States. In terms of what can be done, there's been too much talk about sending hope and prayers to victims of gun violence. I think there's a couple of things that have to be done. One, there are weapons that should not be on the streets of America that everyday citizens shouldn't have access to. And from a federal level, we have to pass legislation to make sure that those things are not available. That's the first thing. The second thing is when you talk about gun violence and some of the crime statistics, in particular during the pandemic, it's an economic issue. There are socioeconomic issues that are animating people and pushing people to make risky decisions, to victimize other people, to try to take from others because they don't have enough themselves. And so it has to be a two-pronged attack where we address the issue of what kinds of weapons are available and who they're available to and limit that, but also where we make sure that we're not putting people in an environment where turning to violence feels like the only choice they have to be able to get by.
Yes. Mark, as human rights issue abuses probably, in terms of that, no country is is perfect. No country has a perfect human rights record. But the thing is, like, for a lot of people, you see the double standard, the practice by the United States, by the Western nations, mostly. Canada, for example, recently, the truck drivers, their protest, they were basically exercising their freedom and their rights. But if similar things happened in Hong Kong, in China's Hong Kong, and then they should be supported worldwide. If there's anything done by the Chinese government or the Hong Kong government, then the Chinese government will be vehemently attacked. And also in Xinjiang, China take proper measures to crack down on terrorism and de-radicalization, and China was demonized, despite the lack of evidence. This kind of double standards, some say, actually hurts the human rights cause around the world. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I've already spoken about the politicization and weaponization of human rights, the hypocrisy by the United States. But there actually is a need for and a way to have a respectful dialogue about human rights, something that is necessary between countries of the world. And the United Nations theoretically should be the place to do this, if this politicization and weaponization using the issue as a club was not taking place. Nearly every country, particularly any countries of size, have factors of their society that could and should be considered human rights violations. And there are things that countries can share with each other if it was done in a respectful, constructive fashion. And that has to take into account cultural differences. We've already talked about the difference between negative or individual conceptions of human rights versus positive or collective conceptions of human rights. There is a real need for a discussion because every country needs to balance those two conceptions of human rights. But that becomes impossible, unfortunately, in the geopolitical climate. And it is a real tragedy to the situation of a real cooperative addressing of human rights between states, between nations around the world. It is a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Victor, I wonder, what do you have to say, looking forward globally, what we need to do as nations, to work together to improve human rights? Mark rightfully mentioned about this different practice because of cultural differences. For example, in China, you walk in the city, like in Beijing, at early morning, like 2 or 3 o'clock, you don't feel any threat. That kind of freedom to security, that kind of freedom to enjoy security, freedom from fear, I would say that's, you don't find it in the United States. So that's a human rights for me. So how can we work together, probably, despite the differences, to truly improve human rights?
Absolutely. I think globally speaking, several things are very important. No weaponization of human rights, no politicization of human rights, not using human rights to achieve ideological goals, and also analyze human rights and their abuses and how to resolve these abuses scientifically, objectively, and try to draw international standards applicable to more countries. Now, no country has a perfect record of human rights, and countries should avoid pretending to be angels of human rights and accusing others as devils in human rights abuses. I think if we have this kind of objectivity and collectivity, for example, then all countries will do a better job in human rights protection and promotion of the human rights standards of mankind as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Brandon, 20 seconds.
We have to start from a place of truth, and as the other guests have said, there are human rights abuses across the world, there are human rights abuses in China, there are human rights abuses in the U.S. What we have to start with, though, is acknowledging the fact that these issues are there, because if we're not acknowledging them, then we certainly can't address them appropriately.
Sorry, we have
this
to
kind of accountability is really important. Go ahead.
With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinzhuo. See you next time.